In a quiet suburb, where neighbors' smiles hide racism, the Johnson family faces a brutal biased attack after moving in. When their joy turns to nightmare due to a call from a hateful neighbor, Eva, the eldest daughter, decides to fight for justice. What they do next will astonish even the most seasoned. But let's start from the beginning. The Johnson family, Daniel, Lila, and their two children, Ava and Jaden, looked forward to moving into their new home in the suburbs. This was a long-awaited step towards a new life, filled with hopes and dreams for a bright future. They chose this neighborhood, believing they would find peace and friendliness. On moving day, the neighboring houses were filled with wary curiosity. Lila noticed several neighbors, including elderly Mrs. Taylor, watching them from behind their windows. "They're probably just curious," she thought, trying to ignore it. But as the hours passed and the Johnsons unpacked boxes, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. Mrs. Taylor, proud of her long history in the neighborhood, approached Daniel, who was painting the fence. With a grim expression, she said, "What are you doing here? This is a quiet place, and we don't want any trouble." Daniel, trying to be polite, replied, "We just want to make a home like everyone else." But in her gaze, he saw discontent that wouldn't fade. That same day, as Jaden happily tossed a ball in the yard, Mrs. Taylor felt the need to act again. Not understanding that her bias was causing harm, she grabbed her phone and called the police, reporting suspicious activity at the neighboring house. Her words felt like a verdict, and she was unaware of the danger her actions posed. When the police arrived, Ava felt her heart race. She saw an officer approach her brother, who was playing outside, and without asking questions, started questioning him about why he was there. Lila, hearing the commotion, rushed out of the house, panic rising. "What's happening?" she shouted as she ran towards them. Daniel also hurried over, trying to understand the situation. The police explained that they had received a call about suspicious activity and had to check the information. Daniel struggled to stay calm, but anger surged within him. He addressed the officers. "They're just kids playing. We just moved in." But his words fell on deaf ears. Ava, standing to the side, felt engulfed by fear and anger. She realized this was not just a coincidence. It was a manifestation of the racial bias they now faced. "We are not victims. We will fight," she resolved, feeling a surge of inner strength. As soon as the police left, Daniel and Lila gathered their children inside, and the tension they had experienced transformed into determination. They decided not to remain silent or let this situation break their spirit. Ava felt it was time to show that they were stronger than ever. The day after the incident, the Johnsons decided not to let bias overshadow their joy in their new home. Lila organized a family meeting to discuss what had happened. "We need to talk about this," she said, clasping her hands. "We are not alone, and we must make it clear that we are part of this neighborhood." Meanwhile, Ava took proactive steps. She created a social media account to share her experience. "This story needs to be heard," she thought, posting a video of the incident that quickly spread online. Soon, the post garnered thousands of views, with comments ranging from support to criticism. Many neighbors, seeing that the Johnsons had become victims of bias, began to realize how their own prejudiced views could lead to such situations. However, not all neighbors sided with the Johnsons. Mrs. Taylor, sensing the growing discontent, tried to justify her actions to the others, claiming she just wanted to ensure safety. But instead, her words only fueled the hatred. She became isolated from most, and her neighbors began to question her actions. Seeing the resonance of her efforts, Ava decided to organize a meeting with neighbors to discuss issues of racial discrimination. She approached Daniel with the idea, "Dad, we need to create a space for conversation. People need to understand what's happening." Daniel supported her, and they began planning a meeting to give everyone a chance to speak. That evening, they sent invitations to neighbors, asking them to come to their home. Ava felt a growing excitement. When the time for the meeting came, many people gathered around the Johnsons' house, but among them was Mrs. Taylor, watching with discontent. She continued to feel pressure from her neighbors, who began to criticize her actions. At the meeting, Ava delivered a heartfelt speech about her feelings. "We just want to be part of this community. We are not a threat," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. Neighbors began to share their own fears and biases, with many acknowledging they had misjudged the situation. Mrs. Taylor stood aside, feeling her world crumbling. After the meeting, Ava realized their fight was just beginning. Many people supported the Johnsons, but Mrs. Taylor remained a stumbling block. The situation began to shift, and the Johnsons felt they were on the right path. But an even bigger battle lay ahead. After the successful meeting, neighbors began to rally around the Johnsons. Ava, inspired by the support, decided to continue her active campaign against racial bias. She started gathering signatures for a petition calling for open forums to discuss racial issues in the neighborhood. Every evening, she went out to the yard with sheets of paper, and people approached her to show their support. Mrs. Taylor, noticing that her actions were causing public discontent, felt increasingly isolated. She tried to justify her actions at meetings, but became a target for ridicule and criticism. Neighbors started asking her uncomfortable questions, and her authority waned. Realizing that her efforts were starting to bear fruit, Ava decided to organize another event, a Unity Day. She invited all neighborhood residents to a picnic where people could communicate, share stories, and build bridges. Coordinating with her parents, she became the main organizer. Lila and Daniel helped with preparations, and the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. On the day of the picnic, residents gathered around the Johnsons' house, including those who had initially opposed them. In an atmosphere of friendliness and openness, everyone discussed their experiences and fears. Ava gave a speech, urging everyone towards unity and understanding. "We must be one family, despite our differences," she exclaimed. Meanwhile, Mrs. Taylor attended the picnic, her face a mix of shame and anger. She watched as people she once deemed inappropriate interacted and laughed. For a moment, her gaze met Ava's. The girl decided to approach her. "Mrs. Taylor, let's talk," she said, her voice resolute. At first, Mrs. Taylor hesitated, but under pressure from other neighbors, she agreed. They stepped aside, and Ava tried to explain how her actions impacted their family. "We just want to be part of this community, like you," she said sincerely. Mrs. Taylor, seeing her openness, felt an internal struggle, but still kept her distance. The picnic ended on a high note, with many discussions and new friendships formed. Ava and her family felt that their efforts were starting to yield results, but within Mrs. Taylor, conflicts raged. Her bias began to crack under the pressure of openness and understanding. But would it be enough to change her perception? Ava knew that much work lay ahead, and the following week she planned to gather everyone to discuss further steps. It was time for change, and the Johnsons were ready to fight for their place in this community. The following week, Ava organized an open meeting for anyone interested. She invited representatives from local organizations and activists to speak about issues of racial bias and the importance of unity in the community. When the time came, the hall was filled with neighbors, many of whom were new friends of the Johnsons. Mrs. Taylor also attended, but her face showed confusion. Ava spotted her in the crowd and decided to approach once more to try and establish dialogue. "Mrs. Taylor, your support is important to us. We can do this together," she said, not expecting a response. At the meeting, Ava delivered an emotional speech about her experiences and how bias affects their lives. She shared not only her fears, but also her dreams for a future where everyone could live in peace. Neighbors listened with interest, and some began to realize how their own biases could impact the Johnsons. After the speeches, it was time for open discussion. Many neighbors began to express their feelings, sharing personal stories, and the atmosphere grew increasingly charged. Feeling the need to speak, Mrs. Taylor stood up and said, "I made a mistake. I let fear and bias cloud my judgment." This admission shocked the audience, but also drew support from other neighbors. Ava approached her, her eyes shining. "Thank you for saying that, Mrs. Taylor. We can all change." This phrase became a turning point. Numerous neighbors began to applaud, and the atmosphere filled with hope. As the meeting concluded, people exchanged contact information and discussed how they could work together to address bias in the community. Ava felt that her efforts were not in vain. The Johnsons and their new friends began planning events aimed at uniting the community, including meetings where people could share their stories and learn from one another. While bias and fear would not disappear overnight, Ava and her family became symbols of change. They understood that their fight was just beginning, but they were not alone. United with their neighbors, they could create a more just and cohesive community. Mrs. Taylor became part of this process, and slowly but surely, the atmosphere began to shift towards acceptance and understanding.